Hello, everyone. Hello, book lovers. How are you today? I know I've just texted that we might be 5 minutes late today because I saw the post then just arriving and I thought, well, they're going to ring the bell at the moment that I start our live session. And I'm actually expecting a book to arrive today. And I'm not sure if it fits in the mailbox. So they might have to ring the bell, but I see that he's just left. So it's not my book yet. um, so I already apologize in advance in case the bell rings and the postman comes to deliver my book. But I think that's something you are familiar with when you order something on the internet, especially a book, then you get excited to receive it. And I'll be sharing with you this book on Instagram. All right. So, welcome. Today's session 7 of our guided reading of Sense and Sensibility. So, we've been doing this for almost 2 months, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I have. I think it's such a great opportunity to really dig deep into a specific book and to read it with attention, right? So, paying attention not only to the plot, but also to the textual elements, the fiction, the elements of fiction, as within the plot. So how the plot is framed, how the story is framed, the narrative style, and connections with historical information, social, cultural contexts, which is very important for a creative reading of the novel. And that's something we talk about and we practice at the Creative Reader Academy at Books and Culture. Speaking of the Creative Reader Academy, I see that two of my students are here, Michelle and Megan. Welcome. And you've got your tea and coffee ready for our Jane Austen o'clock. Today, so let me take a look. Oh yes, today I have exciting news because I have a date for the opening of registration for the course, the theme course, the Jane Austen Club at Books and Culture. So get ready because on the 27th of March, on a Monday, I will open registration for the course, the Jane Austen Club. It's a 4-module course. It's all online, so you can watch the lessons in your own rhythm. And we're going to talk about, you're going to learn a lot about Jane Austen's life, her writing career, her relationship with her family, her letters, her early fiction, her juvenilia, the published novels. We'll talk specifically about all the 6 published novels, her unfinished works, the critical reception of her works. What else? The professional woman writer in the 19th century. Very nice lesson. And the cult of Jane Austen. So how did she become this icon, this cultural icon, right? So if you're interested, stay tuned. On the 27th of March, you can access the website booksandculture.club and register for the course. So that's good news. Other thing is that I have started uploading our discussions here. So this guided reading sessions also to my podcast, An Overview of English Literature. So perhaps if you don't have the time or a video is a bit tricky for you, you can also follow the guided reading sessions audio only on via the podcast, and you can access it in all platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcast, you name it. You can find it there. An overview of English literature. Um, and all these videos are also recorded, so you can go back and watch them here on the YouTube channel anytime you want. And if you're here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. So in this manner, you help books and culture to grow and to reach a wider audience. So last time we talked about chapters 18 to 21. And today we're going to talk about chapters 22 to 25. So today we're going to finish volume 1 of Sense and Sensibility. There are 3 volumes. And we're going to start volume 2. I have my tea ready here. And still hot though, for us to start our discussion. But first, let's refresh our minds. Let's revise what we talked about last time. So last time we talked about how Eleanor and Edward continued to talk indirectly. So speaking plainly and speaking directly, communicating directly, was not considered proper at the time, especially depending on your levels of intimacy. So of course, with your close family, it was a bit different. But still not as free as nowadays. But for instance, the communication between Edward and Eleanor, so they are not directly related. Well, he is the brother of her sister-in-law, married to her half-brother, so they are in a way related, but they are not intimate. So they cannot really talk plainly one-on-one, and they are both very shy. They have both very introvert personalities. That's why they get along very well. But they have this difficulty in communicating and expressing their feelings. So instead of being more direct, such as Marianne, for instance, Eleanor and Edward, they talk to each other through a conversation with Marianne. Remember that chapter that we've read? So that's kind of how they figured out a way to express how they feel without speaking directly to the other person. We also talked about different appreciations of nature. So how Edward sees nature as for its agricultural and practical use. Marianne, on the other hand, has a picturesque, a romantic appreciation of nature. So she likes to experience being with nature, wild nature. So she appreciates running wild outside, wind, storms, and she likes to pay attention to the details of how the leaves fall during the autumn, and so on and so forth. And Willoughby, so Willoughby also has a more, let's say, picturesque connection with nature, such as Marianne, although he was mirroring her personality in a way. But he's known for hunting, so a male domination of nature, so also different. We also talked about one specific detail that says a lot. When Edward came to visit the Dashwoods at Barton Cottage, he was wearing a different ring, and inside this ring there was a lock of hair, of fine hair. And Eleanor thinks, both Eleanor and Marianne think that it's actually Eleanor's hair. And Marianne, in her, let's say, ignorance of their relationship, thought that Eleanor had given that lock of hair to Edward, whereas Eleanor knows that she did not do that. So she's thinking, how could he have taken that lock of hair from her without her noticing? And that's a token of affection, right? So carrying a part of the body of the person you love. So a lock of hair wasn't the most common one, but also a status symbol because it's a gold ring, right? And then Edward leaves. He is struggling with a sense of duty and his own desires. So we talked about how he was struggling with the pressure from his family to be someone that he does not want to. So his family has high ambitions for him, especially his mother and his sister. Um, they want him to be a member of parliament, to be maybe a lawyer, to be the navy and the army. Were okay, but not as better as, but not as good as being in parliament or working with the law. But that's not what Edward wants. Edward wants to work in the church, and that's not fashionable enough for for the Ferrers family. So he's struggling to be independent, to have his own money, to do what he wants with his life. So he's very melancholy when he's there visiting, and he leaves. And we see how differently Eleanor reacts to the departure of her beloved one in comparison with Marianne. So Marianne gave vent to her feelings, to her emotions, to experiencing grief, mourning Willoughby. And Eleanor is quite the opposite. She does not want to be alone, and she uses employment as the antidote of sorrow. So she becomes very busy. She doesn't want to have time to think, probably. There we were introduced to new characters. Mr. Palmer, terrible Mr. Palmer, always aloof to escape his own marriage. And his wife, Mrs. Palmer, who is also a kind of terrible character because they are in a terrible marriage, but they're stuck. They cannot get rid of one another, and they cope differently. So what Mr. Palmer does is he just stays aloof, distracted. He reads the paper. He doesn't interact to, let's say, survive this marriage. And what Mrs. Palmer does, which is very sad, we talked about it, she exaggerates and she fakes her own happiness. She's considered silly by her husband, but is she really silly? That's something that I wonder. Or did she get what she wanted? You know, she's in a marriage that is good for her, practically speaking, but emotionally speaking, it's not. So she has a determination to be happy rather than actually being happy. So she's determined to show happiness, to smile all the time, laugh all the time. But deep inside, that's not how she feels. So that's very, very sad. And a complex character by Jane Austen here. Do you agree? Let me know what you think of Mrs. Palmer. And she's Mrs. Jennings' other daughter. And in Mrs. Palmer's speech, we noticed how the word excessively is used excessively by Jane Austen. So, indeed, to raise awareness of this excessive fake facade that she has built for herself to pretend that she's happy. Perhaps she thinks, you know, if I just pretend I'm happy, I might someday actually feel happy. And we get to know at the end, last time we got to know Anne and Lucy Steele. So the two young ladies that arrive at Barton Park as Sir John's guests. Even though he didn't know them at all. Lady Middleton was, oh, what are they doing here? But okay, the girls began to compliment, to praise Lady Middleton and to praise her children. So they were very smart in buying buying Lady Middleton's admiration. But they are very silly girls, and Eleanor and Marianne they're forced by Sir John to be with the two other girls because, you know, they're the same age, so why can't they be friends? But they have very different personalities. For instance, the eldest one, and still only talks about Beau, so the charming young man that she sees around. And they do everything to please Lady Middleton, as I said. And at the very end of the chapter, we see something very interesting. Eleanor is surprised that the girls know Edward Ferrars. And that's what we're going to continue talking about today. So let's start with chapter 20. 22, which is the last chapter in volume 1. Let's take a look at that. And we are going to get to know the young girls, the Miss Stills, better. And a conversation, very important conversation between Eleanor Dashwood and Lucy Steele. So let's get started. So grab your copy of Sense and Sensibility and let's take a look at chapter 22. Marianne, who had never much toleration for anything like impertinence, vulgarity, inferiority of parts, or even difference of taste from herself, was at this time particularly ill disposed, from the state of her spirits, to be pleased with the Miss Stills, or to encourage their advances. Here, when Austen uses the term inferiority of parts, it means inferiority of abilities. So they're not very educated, the Miss Stills. And Marianne and Eleanor feel like they don't have much to talk about or much to enjoy with these two girls, but they're forced together. And to the invariable coldness of her behavior towards them, which checked every endeavor at intimacy on their side, Eleanor principally attributed that preference of herself, which soon became evident in the manners of both, but specially of Lucy, who missed no opportunity of engaging her in conversation or of striving to improve their acquaintance by an easy and frank communication of her sentiments. Lucy was naturally clever. So Lucy was a silly girl, but she was clever, and you will see why. So from the beginning, she is more interested in Eleanor than Marianne, and she wants to become close to Eleanor. Lucy was naturally clever. Her remarks were often just and amusing, and as a companion for half an hour, Eleanor frequently found her agreeable. But her powers had received no aid from education. She was ignorant and illiterate, and her deficiency of all mental improvement, her want of information in the most common particulars, could not be concealed from Miss Dashwood, in spite of her constant endeavor to appear to advantage. Eleanor saw and pitied her for the neglect of abilities which education might have rendered so respectable. But she saw with less tenderness of feeling the through want of delicacy, of rectitude, and integrity of mind which her attentions, her assiduities, her flatteries at the park betrayed. And she could have no lasting satisfaction in the company of a person who joined insincerity with ignorance, whose want of instruction prevented their meeting in conversation on terms of equality, and whose conduct towards others made every show of attention and deference towards herself perfectly valueless. Well, Eleanor is very harsh here. We're reading this part of the story through her point of view. So Eleanor gives a lot of importance to education, and she's, of course, right in doing so. She appreciates the company of Colonel Brandon, for example. She likes talking with Edward Ferrars. She hates all those empty social interactions that happen at Lady Middleton's house, so all the noisy card games and noisy balls that add nothing to her mental capacity. But at the same time, she pities Lucy Steele because she thinks that she is naturally clever, so she has a lot of potential, but she was not given the possibility or the opportunity to receive a proper education, a formal education. So you see here Jane Austen advocating the importance of education for women. And in this regard, she echoes the arguments, the theory that that Mary Wollstonecraft puts forward in her book *A Vindication of the Rights of Woman*. And there are many parallels between Wollstonecraft's work and Jane Austen's novels. Wollstonecraft is considered to be the first feminist in English language, and her book *Vindication of the Rights of Woman* considered to be the first English feminist book. And her main claim in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft's main claim is that there is, at the time, end of the 18th century, there was an inequality of gender. So men and women were treated differently because of their access to education. So women did not have access to education, and that's why they were inferior to men at the time. So what women needed was access to education, enlarging their mind. There is a very nice quote that I always bring up when I'm talking about Wollstonecraft, and perhaps I've done it here as well already. She said, enlarging, no, strengthen the female mind by enlarging it with education, and there will be an end to blind obedience. Something like that. And I just love how powerful that quote is. So this is what Jane Austen is putting forward here through this depiction of Lucy Steele. Now let's continue. You will think my question an odd one, I dare say, said Lucy to her one day as they were walking together from the park to the cottage. But pray, are you personally acquainted with your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrars? Eleanor did think the question a very odd one, and her countenance expressed it, as she answered that she had never seen Mrs. Ferrars. Indeed, replied Lucy, I wonder at that, for I thought you must have seen her at Norland sometimes. Then perhaps you cannot tell me what sort of a woman she is. No, returned Eleanor, cautious of giving her real opinion of Edward's mother, and not very desirous of satisfying what seemed impertinent curiosity. I know nothing of her. I'm sure you think me very strange for inquiring about her in such a way, said Lucy, eyeing Eleanor attentively as she spoke. But perhaps there may be reasons. I wish I might venture. But however, I hope you will do me the justice of believing that I do not mean to be impertinent. Remember, you should not ask questions that don't concern you, or private questions. So Eleanor finds this very odd, this question here. But Lucy wants to say that this is not impertinent curiosity. Eleanor made her a civil reply, and they walked on for a few minutes in silence. It was broken by Lucy, who renewed the subject again by saying with some hesitation, I cannot bear to have you think me impertinently curious. I am sure I would rather do anything in the world than be thought so by a person whose good opinion is so well worth having as yours. And I am sure I should not have the smallest fear of trusting you. Indeed, I should be very glad of your advice how to manage in such an uncomfortable situation as I am. But however, there is no occasion to trouble you. I am sorry you do not happen to know Mrs. Ferrars. I'm sorry I do not, said Eleanor in great astonishment. If it could be of any use to you to know my opinion of her. But really, I never understood that you were at all connected with that family, and therefore I am a little surprised, I confess, at so serious an inquiry into her character. I dare say you are, and I am sure I do not at all wonder at it. But if I dared tell you all, you would not be so much surprised. Mrs. Ferrars is certainly nothing to me at present, but the time may come, how soon it will come must depend upon herself, when we may be very intimately connected. She looked down as she said this, amiably bashful, with only one side glance at her companion to observe its effects on her. Look how clever Lucy still is. She looks at Eleanor to see how she responds to this piece of information. Good heavens, cried Eleanor. What do you mean? Are you acquainted with Mr. Robert Ferrars? Can you be? And she did not feel much delighted with the idea of such a sister-in-law. No, replied Lucy, not to Mr. Robert Ferrars. I never saw him in my life. But, fixing her eyes upon Eleanor, to his elder brother. So Lucy is suggesting here that there might be something happening between her and the eldest Ferrars, who is Edward Ferrars, Eleanor's Edward Ferrars. So you can imagine how Eleanor felt at that moment. She thought Lucy was talking about Edward's brother. And remember that in the previous session, we read that conversation when all the two Miss Stills and the two Miss Dashwoods were present, and Mrs. Jennings, I think, as well. And they were asking who was Eleanor's love interest. And they said, someone said, probably Sir John or someone said, that it was Edward Ferrars. And now Lucy pretends like she never heard of this before, like she never heard about Eleanor's interest in Edward. What felt Eleanor at that moment? Astonishment that would have been as painful as it was strong, had not an immediate disbelief of the assertion attended it. She turned towards Lucy in silent amazement, unable to divine the reason or object of such a declaration. And though her complexion varied, she stood firm in incredulity and felt in no danger of a hysterical fit or a swoon. So, again, she feels astonished, but she controls herself as always. And her first reaction is to think she must be lying. No, that's not true. She trusts herself more than she trusts Lucy Steele. And remember how she needs proof of everything. She wanted a proof of Marianne's and Willoughby's attached engagement, and now she wants proof to see if Lucy Steele is telling the truth. Megan says, a film reference in my book says Lucy is most viciously portrayed in the 1971 miniseries by Francis Kuka. Well, that's interesting. I've never seen this 1971 miniseries. I wonder, so once we finish reading together Sense and Sensibility, we might extend our discussion to film adaptations if you're interested. And I will try to find this, of course, older series or movies are more difficult to find, but I'll try to find this 1971 miniseries to see how Lucy is portrayed. It's very interesting to compare how actors play these characters differently, right? Viciously portrayed. I like that expression. So Lucy is most viciously portrayed. Again, a woman who shows a facade of silliness, although she's like a pretty silly girl, but she puts on this facade of naive, sweet, charming, simple girl, but she's actually a lot of machinations going on in her brain. How can she better profit from the situation she's in? Megan says, I also haven't watched it yet. I would definitely love to continue the film discussions. So that's a good idea. Let's write it down and perhaps we can make it a Zoom session at the end to celebrate the end of this project and talk about the movie adaptations of Sense and Sensibility. Excellent. So let's continue. Michelle says, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Definitely. There's so many of those in Jane Austen's world because it's a world of appearances, right? As we see here all the time, they pretend to be something they're not. They are forced to play a role in society. And you see a lot of deception because of such false appearances. Or first impressions, I was going to say. First impressions is the false first impressions. First Impressions is the original title of Pride and Prejudice, which is also all about appearances and how appearances can be deceiving, especially in such a social world as late 18th, early 19th century English high society. You may well be surprised, continued Lucy, for to be sure you could have had no idea of it before, for I dare say he never dropped the smallest hint of it to you or any of your family, because it was always meant to be a great secret, and I'm sure has been faithfully kept so by me to this hour. Not a soul of all my relations know of it, but Anne, and I never should have mentioned it to you. if I had not felt the greatest dependence in the world upon your secrecy. Now, is that the reason why she tells Eleanor? And I really thought my behavior in asking so many questions about Mrs. Ferrars must seem so odd that it ought to be explained. And I do not think Mr. Ferrars can be displeased when he knows I have trusted you, because I know he has the highest opinion in the world of all your family, and looks upon yourself and the other Miss Dashwoods quite as his own sisters. She paused. Look at Lucy's choice of words. Edward looks at you and your sister, you and Marianne, as his sisters. So, not as a wife, as a sister. Eleanor, for a few moments, remained silent. She controls herself. Her astonishment at what she heard was at first too great for words, but at length, forcing herself to speak, and to speak cautiously, she said with a calmness of manner which tolerably well concealed her surprise and solicitude. May I ask if your engagement is of long standing? We have been engaged these 4 years. 4 years. Yes. Eleanor, though greatly shocked, still felt unable to believe it. I did not know, said she, that you were even acquainted till the other day. Our acquaintance, however, is of many years' date. He was under my uncle's care, a considerable while. Your uncle? Yes, Mr. Pratt. Did you never hear him talk of Mr. Pratt? So Edward was under the care of Mr. Pratt, meaning that Mr. Pratt was his tutor and would prepare him for university entrance. So they would go to university very early at the time, 14 years old or so. Remember, we talked about different ways that you could go to university, and if you were from a high social class, you could be just a visitor, a tourist. There was a name for that, I forgot now. There was, let me check that. Like a tourist at the university. So you would pay to be there. Of course, the university would need your money. And you could stay there. You would not need to take any exams or anything. And after a period of a certain time, you would receive an MA, a master's degree. Here it says about Oxford, right? Possibly an allusion to the most fashionable and idle rank of Oxford students at the time, the status of a gentleman commoner. So that was the term, gentleman commoner. A university position free of exams and normal college discipline, and after 3 years of residence, terminating in an honorary master's degree. The examinations throughout the university were notoriously lax. Edward's remark on being idle reflects the opinions of contemporary satirists in alluding to a general slackness at Oxford. So Edward spent some time in Oxford, we don't know, maybe 4 years, maybe the time of their engagement. So they had this engagement when he was still under the care of Mr. Pratt, and then he went to university, and now he left university. So during this 4 years of engagement, he was there. So that's how Lucy still knows Edward, because she is the niece of his tutor. I think I have, replied Eleanor with an exertion of spirits which increased with her increase of emotion. He was 4 years with my uncle, who lives at Longstaple, near Plymouth. It was there our acquaintance begun, for my sister and me was often staying with my uncle, and it was there our engagement was formed, though not till a year after he had quitted as a pupil. But he was almost always with us afterwards. I was very unwilling to enter into it, as you may imagine, without the knowledge and approbation of his mother, but I was too young and loved him too well to be so prudent as I ought to have been. Though you do not know him so well as me, Miss Dashwood, you must have seen enough of him to be sensible he's very capable of making a woman sincerely attached to him. Look at how she's playing Eleanor here, huh? How she's using the words to hurt Eleanor. In other words, she cannot say plainly, forget about Edward, he's mine, he never thought of you seriously, and it's normal that women fall in love with him because he's such a nice man, but he's mine. She cannot say that. So instead, she uses this kind of indirect language. Certainly, answered Eleanor, without knowing what she said. Poor Eleanor. But after a moment's reflection, she added with revived security of Edward's honor and love, and her companion's falsehood. Engaged to Mr. Edward Ferrars. I confess myself so totally surprised at what you tell me that really, I beg your pardon, but surely there must be some mistake or of person or name. We cannot mean the same Mr. Ferrars. We can mean no other, cried Lucy, smiling. Mr. Edward Ferrars, the eldest son of Mrs. Ferrars of Park Street, and brother of your sister-in-law, Mrs. John Dashwood, is the person I mean. You must allow that I am not likely to be deceived as to the name of the man on whom all my happiness depends. It is strange, replied Eleanor in a most painful perplexity, that I should never have heard him even mention your name. You see the rivalry here? They're both shooting at each other with words. No, considering our situation, it was not strange. Our first care has been to keep the matter secret. You knew nothing of me or my family, and therefore there could be no occasion for ever mentioning my name to you. And as he was always particularly afraid of his sister suspecting anything, that was reason enough for him not mentioning it. She was silent. Eleanor's security sank, but her self command did not sink with it. She still has self command. 4 years you have been engaged, said she with a firm voice. Yes, and heaven knows how much longer we may have to wait. Poor Edward! It puts him quite out of heart. Then, taking a small miniature from her pocket, she added, to prevent the possibility of mistake, be so good as to look at this face. It does not do him justice, to be sure, but yet I think you cannot be deceived as to the person it was drew for. I have had it above this 3 years. She put it into her hands as she spoke, and when Eleanor saw the painting, whatever other doubts her fear of a too hasty decision or her wish of detecting falsehood might suffer to linger in her mind, she could have none of its being Edward's face. She returned it almost instantly, acknowledging the likeness. So Lucy still had in her pocket a miniature painting, a miniature portrait of Edward Ferrars, and she showed it to Eleanor to prove that they were talking about the same Edward. And also, it meant, well, if she has this token of affection, it means that, well, she's probably saying the truth. Otherwise, why would she have a miniature portrait of Edward in her pocket? I have never been able, continued Lucy, to give him my picture in return, which I am very much vexed at, for he has been always so anxious to get it. But I am determined to sit for it the very first opportunity. Now let's think about something. So we are 21st century readers. We take pictures all the time. You can see me live right now, regardless of where you are in the world. So we take images for granted, right? But try to take your mind back in time. So back then, to have the picture of the person you loved would be very, very difficult. So there were no photographs still at the beginning of the 19th century. So it had to be portraits, paintings, or illustrations or drawings. So it was much more work to get your picture done. And to get somebody else's picture would only happen in very important circumstances, such as an engagement or, a deep family relationship, mother and daughter, father and daughter, etc. You are quite in the right, replied Eleanor calmly. They then proceeded a few paces in silence. Lucy spoke first. She always speaks first. I'm sure, said she, I have no doubt in the world of your faithfully keeping this secret, because you must know of what importance it is to us not to have it reach his mother, for she would never approve of it, I dare say. I shall have no fortune, and I fancy she is an exceeding proud woman. I certainly did not seek your confidence, said Eleanor, but you do me no more than justice in imagining that I may be depended on. Your secret is safe with me, but pardon me if I express some surprise at so unnecessary a communication. You must at least have felt that my being acquainted with it could not add to its safety. Why did Lucy still say all this to Eleanor? Why do you think? Eleanor says, I never asked for this confidence, and I don't know why you're telling me this because I have nothing to do with the situation. But what was Lucy's motive, in your opinion? As she said this, she looked earnestly at Lucy, hoping to discover something in her countenance, perhaps the falsehood of the greatest part of what she had been saying, but Lucy's countenance suffered no change. I was afraid you would think I was taking a great liberty with you, said she, in telling you all this. I have not known you long, to be sure, personally at least, but I have known you and all your family by description a great while, and as soon as I saw you, I felt almost as if you was my old acquaintance. So perhaps you've noticed now that Lucy's speech, she makes quite a few grammar mistakes. So that also points to her lack of formal education. So here, for instance, she said, I almost felt as if you was an old acquaintance instead of as if you were. Besides, in the present case, I really thought some explanation was due to you after my making such particular inquiries about Edward's mother, and I am so unfortunate that I have not a creature whose advice I can ask. Anne is the only person that knows of it, and she has no judgment at all. Indeed, she does me a great deal more harm than good, for I am in constant fear of her betraying me. She does not know how to hold her tongue, as you must perceive, and I am sure I was in the greatest fright in the world the other day when Edward's name was mentioned by Sir John Eliot, lest she should out with it all. The other day she's referring to is when she found out that Eleanor had feelings for Edward. You can't think how much I go through in my mind from it altogether. I only wonder that I am alive after what I have suffered for Edward's sake these last 4 years. Everything in such suspense and uncertainty, and seeing him so seldom, we can hardly meet above twice a year. I am sure I wonder my heart is not quite broke. Here she took out her handkerchief, but Eleanor did not feel very compassionate. Eleanor is still not buying this performance. Sometimes, continued Lucy, after wiping her eyes, I think whether it would not be better for us to break off the matter entirely. As she said this, she looked directly at her companion to check Eleanor's reaction. But then at other times I have not resolution enough for it. I cannot bear the thoughts of making him so miserable as I know the very mention of such a thing would do. And on my own account too, so dear as he is to me, I don't think I could be equal to it. What would you advise me to do in such a case, Miss Dashwood? What would you do yourself? The audacity of Miss Lucy Steele asking Eleanor what she would do in this situation. Would she break it off with Edward or not? And by asking that question, then Lucy would know how Eleanor feels, because if Eleanor says, well, I think you should break it up, it's probably because Eleanor wants Edward for herself. Let's see what Eleanor replies. Pardon me, replied Eleanor, startled by the question, but I can give you no advice under such circumstances. Your own judgment must direct you. To be sure, continued Lucy, after a few minutes' silence on both sides, his mother must provide for him some time or other, but poor Edward is so cast down about it. Did not you think him dreadful low-spirited when he was at Barton? He was so miserable when he left us at Longstaple to go to you that I was afraid you would think him quite ill. Did he come from your uncle's then when he visited us? Oh, yes, he had been staying a fortnight with us. Did you think he came directly from town? No, replied Eleanor, most feelingly sensible of every fresh circumstance in favor of Lucy's veracity. I remember he told us that he had been staying a fortnight with some friends near Plymouth. She remembered, too, to her surprise at the time, at his mentioning nothing farther of those friends, at his total silence with respect even to their names. Did not you think him sadly out of spirits? Repeated Lucy. We did indeed, particularly so when he first arrived. I begged him to exert himself for fear you should suspect what was the matter, but it made him so melancholy, not being able to stay more than a fortnight with us, and seeing me so much affected. Poor fellow! I am afraid it is just the same with him now, for he writes in wretched spirits. I heard from him just before I left Exeter. Taking a letter from her pocket and carelessly showing the direction to Eleanor. Carelessly, very carefully, I would say. You know his hand, I dare say, a charming one it is, but that is not written so well as usual. He was tired, I dare say, for he had just filled the sheet to me as full as possible. So now she brings another proof, a letter from Edward. And remember, the exchange of letters was something very intimate. Single girls and single men were not allowed to exchange letters unless they were engaged. Remember, Eleanor said, well, if Marianne receives a letter from Willoughby, if they communicate via letters, then I will rest satisfied because I will know that their engagement really exists. So now she finds out that Edward and Lucy were corresponding via letters. So I think that's the final blow. Eleanor saw that it was his hand, and she could doubt no longer. The picture, she had allowed herself to believe, might have been accidentally obtained. It might not have been Edward's gift, but a correspondence between them by letter could subsist only under a positive engagement, could be authorized by nothing else. For a few moments she was almost overcome. Her heart sunk within her, and she could hardly stand. But exertion, that's a word used a lot to refer to Eleanor, but exertion was indispensably necessary, and she struggled so resolutely against the oppression of her feelings that her success was speedy and for the time complete. Writing to each other, said Lucy, returning the letter into her pocket, is the only comfort we have in such long separations. Yes, I have one that I have one other comfort in his picture, but poor Edward has not even that. If he had but my picture, he says he should be easy. I gave him a lock of my hair set in a ring when he was at Longstaple last, and that was some comfort to him, he said, but not equal to a picture. Perhaps you might notice the ring when you saw him? I did, said Eleanor with a composure of voice under which was concealed an emotion and distress beyond anything she had ever felt before. She was mortified, shocked, confounded. Fortunately for her, they had now reached the cottage, and the conversation could be continued no farther. After sitting with them a few minutes, the Miss Stills returned to the park, and Eleanor was then at liberty to think and be wretched. And that's the end of chapter 22, and that's the end of volume 1. So we leave Eleanor at this state of mind. She's mortified, shocked, confounded. She's feeling such strong emotions she's never felt before, but she exerts herself, she controls her feelings, she puts on a facade until the others leave, and when she's alone, she's finally at liberty to think, be wretched. Only alone does she allow herself to feel. Oh, let's see the comments here. Megan says, Lucy is the equivalent of a mosquito that you keep missing when you try to smack it. A very annoying mosquito indeed, this Lucy. Annoying Eleanor. and making her suffer so much. Michelle says, Lucy is so vindictive. Yes, she's vicious. She's not saying this because she thinks she can trust Eleanor. Why else would she say all this to her and show all these proofs? So to show the miniature portrait, to show the letter, to say, to give all the information where Edward was, to say that she gave a lock of hair for him to put in a ring. She's doing that for a reason. She wants to tell Eleanor that she wants to claim Edward for herself, right? And Eleanor is such a good person. Well, she has such high standards, moral standards. She's so virtuous that she would never interfere with someone's engagement. And Michelle also says, why does she have all of these things in her pockets? Very suspicious. Yes, she had a plan all along. So she brought all these things to show to Eleanor and to tell her to back off, right? But she couldn't say that in such words at the time. So she uses indirect conversation and all these objects to prove her affection, her attachment to Edward. Very good. So that was the end of volume 1. So we start now volume 2. So some editions of the novel will count from chapter 1 again, and others continue, like chapter 23. To avoid any misunderstandings, although my edition also says chapter 1, volume 2, I will refer to it as chapter 23, all right? And this chapter is mainly, maybe wholly, through Eleanor's perspective. So let's see how she's feeling. However small Eleanor's general dependence on Lucy's veracity might be, it was impossible for her on serious reflection to suspect it in the present case, where no temptation could be answerable to the folly of inventing a falsehood of such a description. What Lucy had asserted to be true, therefore, Eleanor could not, dared not longer doubt, supported as it was too on every side by such probabilities and proofs. Eleanor was a very pragmatic girl, so she needed proof, she needed probability, certainty. And now she has all of these proofs that contradicted by nothing but her own wishes. Their opportunity of acquaintance in the house of Mr. Pratt was a foundation for the rest, at once indisputable and alarming. And Edward's visit near Plymouth, his melancholy state of mind, his dissatisfaction at his own prospects, his uncertain behavior towards herself, the intimate knowledge of the Miss Stills as to Norland and their family connections, which had often surprised her, the picture, the letter, the ring, formed altogether such a body of evidence as overcame every fear of condemning him unfairly, and established as a fact, which no partiality could set aside, his ill treatment of herself. Her resentment of such behavior, her indignation at having been its dupe for a short time, made her feel only for herself. But other ideas, other considerations soon arose. Had Edward been intentionally deceiving her? Had he feigned a regard for her which he did not feel? Was his engagement to Lucy an engagement of the heart? No, whatever it might once have been, she could not believe it such at present. His affection was all her own. She could not be deceived in that. Her mother's, sisters, Fanny, all had been conscious of his regard for her at Norland. It was not an illusion of her own vanity. He certainly loved her. What a softener of the heart was this persuasion! How much could it not tempt her to forgive? He had been blamable, highly blamable, in remaining at Norland after he first felt her influence over him to be more than it ought to be. In that he could not be defended. But if he had injured her, how much more had he injured himself? If her case were pitiable, his was hopeless. His imprudence had made her miserable for a while, but it seemed to have deprived himself of all chance of ever being otherwise. She might in time regain tranquillity, but he, what had he to look forward to? Could he ever be tolerably happy with Lucy Steele? Could he, were his affection for herself out of the question, with his integrity, his delicacy, and well informed mind, be satisfied with a wife like her, illiterate, artful, and selfish? So we're going through Eleanor's mind here, right? So she starts being angry. She's indignant. How could Edward do this to me? How could he deceive me so? But then she begins to rationalize the situation. And she thinks, no, I'm not mistaken. It was not an illusion of my vanity. I'm sure Edward loves me and that he showed me affection. So, what could possibly be the reason behind all this? And he sees that they are not suitable for each other, Lucy and Edward. She's harsh here. She says, how could he be satisfied with a wife like her, illiterate, artful, and selfish? So let's continue reading what's going on in her mind. The youthful infatuation of 19 would naturally blind him to everything but her beauty and good nature. But the 4 succeeding years which, if rationally spent, give such improvement to the understanding, must have opened his eyes to her defects of education, while the same period of time spent on her side in inferior society and more frivolous pursuits had perhaps robbed her of that simplicity which might once have given an interesting character to her beauty. If in the supposition of his seeking to marry herself, his difficulties from his mother had seemed great, how much greater were they now likely to be, when the object of his engagement was undoubtedly inferior in connections, and probably inferior in fortune to herself. These difficulties, indeed, with a heart so alienated from Lucy, might not press very hard upon his patience. But melancholy was the state of the person by whom the expectation of family opposition and unkindness could be felt as a relief. In the beginning, she was pitying herself, and then she begins to pity Edward. So she's thinking he was engaged when he was 19 years old. So he was young and she was pretty, and that seemed like enough at the time. But then 4 years have passed, 4 years in which a lot can happen. You can improve your mind, or you can just spend your time with frivolous activities and become even sillier than before. So the gap between them probably rose. But once a word is given, an honorable person would never take it back, like Edward. And she's thinking, well, if his mother opposed to Edward marrying her, Eleanor Dashwood, imagine what she would say to him marrying Lucy Steele, which was inferior in connections and fortune. As these considerations occurred to her in painful succession, she wept for him more than for herself. Supported by the conviction of having done nothing to merit her present unhappiness, and consoled by the belief that Edward had done nothing to forfeit her esteem, she thought she could even now, under the first smart of the heavy blow, command herself enough to guard every suspicion of the truth from her mother and sisters. So she's rationalized, she knows what's going on. Now she's going to put up a front and command herself not let show anything. And so well was she able to answer her own expectations that when she joined them at dinner only 2 hours after she had first suffered the extinction of all her dearest hopes, no one would have supposed from the appearance of the sisters that Eleanor was mourning in secret over obstacles which must divide her forever from the object of her love, and that Marianne was internally dwelling on the perfections of a man of whose whole heart she felt thoroughly possessed, and whom she expected to see in every carriage which drove near their house. The necessity of concealing from her mother and Marianne what had been entrusted in confidence to herself, though it obliged her to unceasing exertion, was no aggravation of Eleanor's distress. On the contrary, it was a relief to her to be spared the communication of what would give such affliction to them, and to be saved likewise from hearing that condemnation of Edward, which would probably flow from the excess of their partial affection for herself, and which was more than she felt equal to support. From their counsel or their conversation, she knew she could receive no assistance. Their tenderness and sorrow must add to her distress, while her self command would neither receive encouragement from their example nor from their praise. She was stronger alone, and her own good sense so well supported her that her firmness was as unshaken, her appearance of cheerfulness as invariable, as with regret so poignant and so fresh it was possible for them to be. Look at the words used here. I can you see it? I circled them. Self-command. She was stronger alone. Firmness, unshaken, appearance invariable. Much as she had suffered from her first conversation with Lucy on the subject, she soon felt an earnest wish of renewing it, and this for more reasons than one. She wanted to hear many particulars of their engagement repeated again. She wanted more clearly to understand what Lucy really felt for Edward, whether there were any sincerity in her declaration of tender regard for him, and she particularly wanted to convince Lucy, by her readiness to enter on the matter again, and her calmness in conversing on it, that she was no otherwise interested in it than a friend, which she very much feared her involuntary agitation in their morning discourse must have left, at least doubtful. That Lucy was disposed to be jealous of her appeared very probable. It was plain that Edward had always spoken highly in her praise, not merely from Lucy's assertion, but from her venturing to trust her on so short a personal acquaintance with a secret so confessedly and evidently important. And even Sir John's joking intelligence must have had some weight when he said that Eleanor liked Edward. Not with these words, but you know. But indeed, while Eleanor remained so well assured within herself of being really beloved by Edward, it required no other consideration of probabilities to make it natural that Lucy should be jealous. And that she was so, her very confidence was a proof. She's very confident, Eleanor, of Edward's love. So she thinks, well, she can only be jealous of me. So I'm going to bring this subject up again so that she knows. So I'll let her know that I'm okay with it and that my only interest here is as a friend. What other reason for the disclosure of the affair could there be but that Eleanor might be informed by it of Lucy's superior claims on Edward and be taught to avoid him in future? Exactly. She had little difficulty in understanding thus much of her rival's intentions. And now, for the first time, Lucy is referred to as her rival, and that will come up again. So they become rivals. Although very friendly on the outside, they have this appearance, a facade of very delicate friendship, but deep inside they are rivals, and they know that. And while she was firmly resolved to act by her, as every principle of honor and honesty directed, to combat her own affection for Edward and to see him as little as possible, she could not deny herself the comfort of endeavoring to convince Lucy that her heart was unwounded. And as she could now have nothing more painful to hear on the subject than had already been told, she did not mistrust her own ability of going through a repetition of particulars with composure. So she's going to act with every principle of honor and honesty. She's going to see Edward as little as possible. But because of her pride, she wants Lucy to know that her heart was unwounded. And also she wants to know how Lucy truly feels about Edward, right? But it was not immediately that an opportunity of doing so could be commanded, though Lucy was as well disposed as herself to take advantage of any that occurred. For the weather was not often fine enough to allow of their joining in a walk, where they might most easily separate themselves from the others. And though they met at least every other evening, either at the park or cottage, and chiefly at the former, they could not be supposed to meet for the sake of conversation. Such a thought would never enter either Sir John or Lady Middleton's head, and therefore very little leisure was ever given for general chat, and none at all for particular discourse. They met for the sake of eating, drinking, and laughing together, playing at cards or consequences, or any other game that was sufficiently noisy. Oh, so they see each other every other day, but they don't have any deep conversation. It's just a facade of happiness. It's just noisy social gathering. Um, so they only meet for the sake of, that's everyone there at the Middletons, for the sake of eating, drinking, laughing, playing at cards, consequences, or any other game noisy enough. And that's how they live life. So you see what Jane Austen is doing here. She's criticizing um, the upper classes' frivolous activities in daily life. They have no serious pursuit in life. They have no meaningful conversations, no meaningful activities. They just go through life playing, laughing, eating, and drinking. What's the purpose of such an existence, right? She mentions here playing. Let me take a look at this footnote because I think it's very interesting to know what kind of games they used to play. So, Consequences was a game in which a story of the meeting of a lady and gentleman, including their conversation and its consequences, is concocted by the players of the game, who each in turn adds a fact or a name without knowing what has been contributed by the other players, resembling the children's game of gossip. This is quite an interesting game. So they would play that. And yes, here, sufficiently noisy. The note is the following: a signal of vacancy of mind. That's a good way to put it. Vacancy of mind in Jane Austen's novels. The Middleton party shares this kinship with empty-headed Kitty and Lydia Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, who also enjoy a nice, comfortable, noisy game. The noisier it is, the more distracted you are, the more you forget about other matters, more important, meaningful, relevant matters, right? One or two meetings of this kind had taken place without affording Eleanor any chance of engaging Lucy in private. When Sir John called at the cottage one morning to beg in the name of charity that they would all dine with Lady Middleton that day, as he was obliged to attend the club at Exeter, and she would otherwise be quite alone, except her mother and the two Miss Stills. Quite alone. Eleanor, who foresaw a fairer opening for the point she had in view, in such a party as this was likely to be, more at liberty among themselves under the tranquil and well-bred direction of Lady Middleton than when her husband united them together in one noisy purpose, immediately accepted the invitation. Margaret, with her mother's permission, was equally compliant, and Marianne, though always unwilling to join any of their parties, was persuaded by her mother, who could not bear to have her seclude herself from any chance of amusement, to go likewise. Michelle says empty vessels make the most noise. Yes, because noise is distracting. Also, Sir John never wants to be alone. Lady Middleton doesn't want to be alone. Because when you are alone, you are with your own self. You can think, you can reflect, and that's a dangerous, powerful activity. Eleanor likes to be alone. Marianne likes to be alone, to think. But people like Lady Middleton, Mrs. Jennings, Sir John Middleton, they're always looking for entertainment, being with as many people as possible, as noisy as possible, so they don't really have to think or do anything meaningful, right? The empty vessels of high society. So they went. The young ladies went, and Lady Middleton was happily preserved from the frightful solitude which had threatened her. Now, the sarcasm of the narrator, of course, it would not be frightful, and it would not threaten her, but yeah. The insipidity of the meeting was exactly such as Eleanor had expected. It produced not one novelty of thought or expression, and nothing could be less interesting than the whole of their discourse, both in the dining parlour and drawing room. So nothing meaningful happens. To the letter, the children accompanied them, and while they remained there, she was too well convinced of the impossibility of engaging Lucy's attention to attempt it. They quitted it only with the removal of the tea things. The card table was then placed, and Eleanor began to wonder at herself for having ever entertained a hope of finding time for conversation at the park. They all rose up in preparation for a round game. I am glad, said Lady Middleton to Lucy, you are not going to finish poor little Anna Maria's basket this evening, for I am sure it must hurt your eyes to work filigree by candlelight. And we will make the dear little love some amends for her disappointment tomorrow, and then I hope she will not mind much. She's not glad. She's not glad at all, quite the opposite. So Lady Middleton uses politeness, fake politeness, to speak indirectly. So she says, I'm glad that you're not doing this, Lucy, because otherwise you would hurt your eyes, and we'll just make amends with my daughter when she's wakes up tomorrow and she will be completely disappointed. What she's actually saying is, what are you doing, Lucy? You should be making the basket for my daughter right now. And Lucy knows the hint was enough. Lucy recollected herself instantly and replied, Indeed, you are very much mistaken, Lady Middleton. I am only waiting to know whether you can make your party without me, or I should have been at my filigree already. I would not disappoint the little angel for all the world, and if you want me at the card table now, I am resolved to finish the basket after supper. Now, do you know what filigree is? Filigree. So another kind of female activity, something to pass the time without really occupying your mind, without really challenging your brain. So the kind of activity that was socially accepted that women could do. Here, filigree, decorative art created by rolling stiff paper cut into strips about an eighth of an inch wide, then pinching the rolls into decorative shapes and gluing them onto the object to be decorated. In the book The Young Ladies' School of Art, Hannah Robertson in 1786 writes, Filigree is a very pretty work, and when executed with judgment will last hundreds of years, and may be made to represent various figures such as beasts, birds, houses, flowers, trees, coats of arms, etc. Young Ladies School of Art. It's very beautiful. If you Google it, you will see some people still do it nowadays. It's quite interesting. So it's a sculpture with paper, and Lucy had promised she would make a basket out of paper for one of Lady Middleton's daughters. Oh, you were very good. I hope it won't hurt your eyes. She couldn't care less, right? I hope it won't hurt your eyes. Will you ring the bell for some working candles? My poor little girl would be sadly disappointed, I know, if the basket was not finished tomorrow. For though I told her it certainly would not, I am sure she depends upon having it done. Lucy directly drew her work table near her and reseated herself with an alacrity and cheerfulness which seemed to infer that she could taste no greater delight than in making a filigree basket for a spoiled child. Narrator is great. Lady Middleton proposed a rubber of casino to the others, another game. No one made any objection but Marianne, who, with her usual inattention to the forms of general civility, exclaimed, Your ladyship will have the goodness to excuse me. You know I detest cards. I shall go to the pianoforte. I have not touched it since it was tuned. And without further ceremony, she turned away and walked to the instrument. Lady Middleton looked as if she thanked heaven that she had never made so rude a speech. So perhaps nowadays we would not consider it rude, someone excusing themselves and saying, you know what, I'm not going to play, I don't like playing cards. But Lady Middleton thought it very rude. Let's look at this footnote. So rude a speech. So, according to the Marquis of Halifax, Lady's New Year's Gift or Advice to a Daughter. This was a conduct book. Conduct books were very popular in the late 16th and the whole of the 18th century, books that would tell girls how to behave. Books written by men, mostly. So this was called Lady's New Year's Gift or Advice to a Daughter. A book published in at least three editions in Jane Austen's lifetime cautioned against such unrestricted expression of opinion. And then this is a quote from the conduct book. An unlimited liberty of this kind is little less than sending a herald and proclaiming war to the world, which is an angry beast when so provoked. So girls were not allowed, were not supposed to voice their wants, their opinions, their wishes. They were supposed to do as they were told. So if people are going to play cards, she should play cards and not voice her own wishes and say, I'm not going to play, I'm going to play the piano. So Lady Middleton thought it was extremely rude. And then Eleanor tries to fix things. Marianne can never keep long from that instrument, ma'am, said Eleanor, endeavoring to smooth away the offense. And I do not much wonder at it, for it is the very best toned pianoforte I ever heard. So she adds a compliment here to Lady Middleton to smooth things. The remaining five were now to draw their cards. Perhaps, continued Eleanor, if I should happen to cut out, I may be of some use to Miss Lucy Steele in rolling her papers for her, and there is so much still to be done to the basket that it must be impossible, I think, for her labor singly to finish it this evening. I should like the work exceedingly if she would allow me a share in it. Indeed, I shall be very much obliged to you for your help, cried Lucy, for I find there is more to be done to it than I thought there was, and it would be a shocking thing to disappoint dear Anne Maria after all. Oh, that would be terrible indeed, said Miss Steele. Dear little soul, how I do love her. You are very kind, said Lady Middleton to Eleanor, and as you really like the work, perhaps you will be as well pleased not to cut in till another rubber, or will you take your chance now? So she's saying, okay, so if you want to go, go, that's great, but then don't come back to the game, so you will ruin our game. Eleanor joyfully profited by the first of these proposals, and thus by a little of that address, which Marianne could never condescend to practice, gained her own end and pleased Lady Middleton at the same time. Lucy made room for her with ready attention, and the two fair rivals were thus seated side by side at the same table, and with the utmost harmony engaged in forwarding the same work. The pianoforte, at which Marianne, wrapped up in her own music and her own thoughts, had by this time forgotten that anybody was in the room besides herself, was luckily so near them that Miss Dashwood now judged she might safely, under the shelter of its noise, introduce the interesting subject without any risk of being heard at the card table. And that's the end of chapter 23, or chapter 1 of volume 2. So finally, so it's mainly through Eleanor's perspective, and finally she has the chance to talk to Lucy privately so she can find out more about how she really feels about Edward. And that's what happens in chapter 24. So remember, usually Jane Austen writes more descriptive or inner monologues chapters, and others that are more focused on dialogue. The one we're reading now, chapter 24, is a dialogue chapter, and it is mainly the conversation between Lucy and Eleanor. So let's take a look at how they're going to act, these fair rivals. In a firm, though cautious tone, Eleanor thus began. And now Eleanor begins. Usually it was Lucy, but now Eleanor begins. She's in command. She wants to do things her own way. I should be undeserving of the confidence you have honored me with if I felt no desire for its continuance, or no farther curiosity on its subject. I will not apologize, therefore, for bringing it forward again. Thank you, cried Lucy warmly, for breaking the ice. You have set my heart at ease by it, for I was somehow or other afraid I had offended you by what I told you that Monday. Offended me? How could you suppose so? Believe me, and Eleanor spoke it with the truest sincerity, nothing could be farther from my intention than to give you such an idea. Could you have a motive for the trust that was not honorable and flattering to me? And yet I do assure you, replied Lucy, her little sharp eyes full of meaning. See, her little sharp eyes as knives attacking, full of meaning. There seemed to me to be a coldness and displeasure in your manner that made me quite uncomfortable. I felt sure that you was angry with me. Again, a mistake in grammar. That she was angry with me and have been quarreling with myself ever since for having took another mistake for having took such a liberty as to trouble you with my affairs. But I am very glad. That's why Eleanor refers to her as illiterate. So she makes a lot of language mistakes. But I'm very glad to find it was only my own fancy and that you do not really blame me. If you knew what a consolation it was to me to relieve my heart by speaking to you of what I am always thinking of every moment of my life, your compassion would make you overlook everything else, I'm sure. Indeed, I can easily believe that it was a very great relief to you to acknowledge your situation to me, and be assured that you shall never have reason to repent it. Your case is a very unfortunate one. You seem to me to be surrounded with difficulties, and you will have need of all your mutual affection to support you under them. Mr. Ferrars, I believe, is entirely dependent on his mother. He has only £2,000 of his own. It would be madness to marry upon that, though for my own part I could give up every prospect of more without a sigh. I have been always used to a very small income, and could struggle with any poverty for him. But I love him too well to be the selfish means of robbing him, perhaps, of all that his mother might give him if he married to please her. We must wait. It may be for many years. With almost every other man in the world, it would be an alarming prospect, but Edward's affection and constancy nothing can deprive me of, I know. That conviction must be everything to you, and he is undoubtedly supported by the same trust in yours. If the strength of your reciprocal attachment had failed, as between many people and under many circumstances it naturally would during a 4 years' engagement, your situation would have been pitiable indeed. Lucy here looked up, but Eleanor was careful in guarding her countenance from every expression that could give her words a suspicious tendency. Edward's love for me, said Lucy, has been pretty well put to the test by our long, very long absence since we were first engaged, and it has stood the trial so well that I should be unpardonable to doubt it now. I can safely say that he has never gave me one moment's alarm on that account from the first. Eleanor hardly knew whether to smile or sigh at this assertion. Lucy went on. I'm rather of a jealous temper, too, by nature, and from our different situations in life, from his being so much more in the world than me, and our continual separation, I was enough inclined for suspicion to have found out the truth in an instant if there had been the slightest alteration in his behavior to me when we met, or any lowness of spirits that I could not account for, or if he had talked more of one lady than another, or seemed in any respect less happy at Longstable than he used to be. I do not mean to say that I am particularly observant or quick-sighted in general, but in such a case I'm sure I could not be deceived. So she's indirectly telling Eleanor that nothing of this happened. So he was not talking about any other girl specifically, and he was not less happy than he normally was, meaning he did not show any interest in Eleanor while he was there. All this, thought Eleanor, is very pretty, but he can impose upon neither of us. But what, said she after a short silence, are your views? Or have you known but that of waiting for Mrs. Ferrars' death, which is a melancholy and shocking extremity? Now, practical Eleanor wants to know practical answers. Is her son determined to submit to this and to all the tediousness of the many years of suspense in which it may involve you, rather than run the risk of her displeasure for a while by owning the truth? If we could be certain that it would be only for a while, but Mrs. Ferrars is a very headstrong, proud woman, and in her first fit of anger upon hearing it, would very likely secure everything to Robert. And the idea of that, for Edward's sake. not her, for Edward's sake, frightens away all my inclination for hasty measures. And for your sake, too, or you are carrying your disinterestedness beyond reason, said Eleanor. Lucy looked at Eleanor again and was silent. Well, Lucy is saying, well, I'm only worried for Edward's sake that if we do anything now, we will cause um, his mother's disapproval, and she will cut him off completely and pass all the money to the other son, Robert. And she says it's all for I don't want to be selfish. It's all for Edward's sake, but very practically, Eleanor said, and for your sake as well. Otherwise, you seem too disinterested, and that's not believable. Do you know Mr. Robert Ferrars? Asked Eleanor. Not at all. I never saw him, but I fancy he's very unlike his brother, silly and a great coxcomb. Now, coxcomb, let's see what it meant at the time. 469. A great coxcomb was a foolish, conceited, showy person, vain of his accomplishments, appearance, or dress, a fop. So, Lucy says that he's silly and a great coxcomb. A great coxcomb, repeated Miss Steele, so that's Anne Steele, whose ear had caught those words by a sudden pause in Marian's music. Oh, they are talking of their favorite beau, I dare say. No, sister, cried Lucy, you are mistaken there. Our favorite beaux are not great coxcombs. I can answer for it that Miss Dashwood's is not, said Mrs. Jennings, laughing heartily, for he is one of the modestest, prettiest behaved young men I ever saw. But as for Lucy, she's such a sly little creature, there is no finding out who she likes. Little did Mrs. Jennings know that it was actually the very same man. The two of them liked the same man. Oh, cried Miss Steele, looking significantly round at them. I dare say Lucy's beau is quite as modest and pretty behaved as Miss Dashwood's, because she knows it's the same. Eleanor blushed in spite of herself. Lucy bit her lip and looked angrily at her sister. A mutual silence took place for some time. Lucy first put an end to it by saying in a lower tone, though Marian was then giving them the powerful protection of a very magnificent concerto. I will honestly tell you of one scheme which has lately come into my head for bringing matters to bear. Indeed, I am bound to let you into the secret, for you are a party concerned. I dare say you have seen enough of Edward to know that he would prefer the church to every other profession. Now, my plan is that he should take orders as soon as he can, and then through your interest, which I'm sure you would be kind enough to use out of friendship for him, and I hope out of some regard to me, your brother might be persuaded to give him Norland living, which I understand is a very good one, and the present incumbent not likely to live a great while. That will be enough for us to marry upon, and we might trust to time and chance for the rest. So she wants Eleanor's help. She wants that she wants Edward to take orders, meaning to be ordained as a minister in the Church of England, and for Eleanor to try to persuade her brother, who is now the head at Norland, to give the Norland living to Edward. What does it mean, the Norland living? Landowners, so in this case John Dashwood, often had the legal right to give, to keep in the family, or to sell vacant appointments that were called livings to those churches attached to their estates. So the Norland Church, in this case. The recipient clergyman's income was produced from three principal sources: from his right to tithes, that is, a tenth of the gross product of all cultivated lands in the parish. So the clergyman working at a very profitable estate would receive 1/10 of its profits. From the profits he could secure from farming the land attached to the living, so the profits from farming his own land, and from whatever fees might arise from marriages, baptisms, and burials. Different livings could vary widely in value, so the more profitable estates would also offer more profitable livings to the clergymen there. Um, so that was Lucy's plan. I should be always happy, replied Eleanor, to show any mark of my esteem and friendship for Mr. Ferrars. Not to her, to Mr. Ferrars. But do not you perceive that my interest on such an occasion would be perfectly unnecessary? He is brother to Mrs. John Dashwood. That must be recommendation enough to her husband. She's saying, why are you asking me? Edward is the brother of John Dashwood's wife, so he can talk to them directly. But Mrs. John Dashwood would not much approve of Edward's going into orders. Aha! So she's not going to do that because as Edward's sister does not want him to take orders, she would not approve of this scheme at all. Then I rather suspect that my interest would do very little. They were again silent for many minutes. At length Lucy exclaimed with a deep sigh, I believe it would be the wisest way to put an end to the business at once by dissolving the engagement. Again she brings it up. We seem so beset with difficulties on every side that though it would make us miserable for a time, we should be happier perhaps in the end. But you will not give me your advice, Miss Dashwood. No, answered Eleanor with a smile which concealed very agitated feelings. On such a subject I certainly will not. You know very well that my opinion would have no weight with you unless it were on the side of your wishes. Indeed you wrong me, replied Lucy with great solemnity. I know nobody of whose judgment I think so highly as I do of yours. And I do really believe that if you was to say to me, I advise you by all means to put an end to your engagement with Edward Ferrars, it will be more for the happiness of both of you, I should resolve upon doing it immediately. Now, is she being truthful or is she again testing Eleanor? Eleanor blushed for the insincerity of Edward's future wife and replied, This compliment would effectually frighten me from giving any opinion on the subject had I formed one. It raises my influence much too high. The power of dividing two people so tenderly attached is too much for an indifferent person. 'Tis because you are an indifferent person, said Lucy with some pique, and laying a particular stress on those words, indifferent person, that your judgment might justly have such weight with me. If you could be supposed to be biased in any respect by your own feelings, your opinion would not be worth having. Look at that. So she's emphasizing that Eleanor is or should be an indifferent person. Otherwise, if she had any feelings, anything that could affect her partiality, her impartiality, um, her opinion would be useless. But that's exactly why she's asking Eleanor, because she's not an impartial person. She's very much connected with this whole situation. Eleanor thought it wisest to make no answer to this, lest they might provoke each other to an unsuitable increase of ease and unreserve, and was even partly determined never to mention the subject again. Another pause, therefore, of many minutes' duration succeeded this speech, and Lucy was still the first to end it. I'm sorry for that, returned. Oh, sorry. She was the first to end it. Shall you be in town this winter, Miss Dashwood? Said she with all her customary complacency. Certainly not. I'm sorry for that, returned the other, although we know she's actually happy for that, while her eyes brightened at the information. It would have gave me, again another mistake, it would have gave me such pleasure to meet you there. But I dare say you will go for all that. To be sure, your brother and sister will ask you to come to them. It will not be in my power to accept their invitation if they do. How unlucky that is. I had quite depended upon meeting you there. Anne and me are to go the latter end of January to some relations who have been wanting us to visit them this several years. But I only go for the sake of seeing Edward. He will be there in February. Otherwise, London would have no charms for me. I have not spirits for it. Eleanor was soon called to the card table by the conclusion of the first rubber, and the confidential discourse of the two ladies was therefore at an end, to which both of them submitted without any reluctance, for nothing had been said on either side to make them dislike each other less than they had done before. And Eleanor sat down to the card table with the melancholy persuasion that Edward was not only without affection for the person who was to be his wife, but that he had not even the chance of being tolerably happy in marriage, which sincere affection on her side would have given, for self interest alone could induce a woman to keep a man to an engagement of which she seemed so thoroughly aware that he was weary. So Eleanor finds the truth that she wanted to find. She knows that it's not an engagement of the heart, um, Edward and Lucy's, and she finds out that um, Lucy does not really love Edward. It's more her self-interest alone that's keeping this engagement going. So she feels sorry for Edward. She does not plan to play any part in this. What is done, but she feels sorry for Edward because she thinks that he will never be able to be even tolerably happy in this situation. From this time the subject was never revived by Eleanor, and when entered on by Lucy, who seldom missed an opportunity of introducing it, and was particularly careful to inform her confidante of her happiness whenever she received a letter from Edward, it was treated by the former with calmness and caution, and dismissed as soon as civility would allow, for she felt such conversations to be an indulgence which Lucy did not deserve, and which were dangerous to herself. The visit of the Miss Steeles at Barton Park was lengthened far beyond what the first invitation implied. Their favour increased, they could not be spared. Sir John would not hear of their going, and in spite of their numerous and long arranged engagements in Exeter, in spite of the absolute necessity of their returning to fulfil them immediately, which was in full force at the end of every week, they were prevailed on to stay nearly 2 months at the park, and to assist in the due celebration of that festival which requires a more than ordinary share of private balls and large dinners to proclaim its importance. And that is, of course, Christmas time, the holiday season at the end of the year. So they stayed for almost 2 months, the Miss Steeles. And Marianne and Eleanor and everyone, all the Dashwoods um, had to be with them all this time. So Christmas is over, and we're going to read the last chapter now, chapter 25. This is a little shorter chapter. And we'll see what happens now. So the Miss Steeles are still there for 2 months, and now it's the beginning of a new year. Chapter 25. Though Mrs. Jennings was in the habit of spending a large portion of the year at the houses of her children and friends, she was not without a settled habitation of her own. Since the death of her husband, who had traded with success in a less elegant part of the town, she had resided every winter in a house in one of the streets near Portman Square. Towards this home she began on the approach of January to turn her thoughts, and thither she one day abruptly and very unexpectedly by them asked the elder Miss Dashwoods to accompany her. Eleanor, without observing the varying complexion of her sister and the animated look which spoke no indifference to the plan, immediately gave a grateful but absolute denial for both, in which she believed herself to be speaking their united inclinations. The reason alleged was their determined resolution of not leaving their mother at that time of the year. Mrs. Jennings received the refusal with some surprise, and repeated her invitation immediately. "Oh, Lord, I'm sure your mother can spare you very well, and I do beg you will favour me with your company, for I've quite set my heart upon it. Don't fancy that you will be any inconvenience to me, for I shan't put myself at all out of my way for you. It will only be sending Betty by the coach, and I hope I can afford that. We three shall be able to go very well in my chaise type of carriage." So then this type of carriage fits three, if I'm not mistaken. So she would have to send her servant by coach, pay the coach for her. So she can do that. That's the only thing she will get out of her way of for the sake of the Dashwoods. And when we are in town, if you do not like to go wherever I do, well and good, you may always go with one of my daughters. I'm sure your mother would not object to it, for I have had such good luck in getting my own children off my hands that she will think me a very fit person to have the charge of you. And if I don't get one of you at least well married before I have done with you, it shall not be my fault. I shall speak a good word for you to all the young men, you may depend upon it. So Mrs. Jennings thinks it's actually a good thing that she's gotten rid of her daughters, meaning that all their daughters are married. So that's a compliment for her as a mother. She fulfilled her duty to find suitable husbands for her daughters. So now she has to look beyond, and she's going to find, she says, find husbands for at least one of them before I'm done with them. I have a notion, said Sir John, that Miss Marianne would not object to such a scheme if her elder sister would come into it. It is very hard indeed that she should not have a little pleasure because Miss Dashwood does not wish it. So I would advise you two to set off for town when you are tired of Barton without saying a word to Miss Dashwood about it. Nay, cried Mrs. Jennings, I'm sure I shall be monstrous glad of Miss Marianne's company, whether Miss Dashwood will go or not. Only the more the merrier, say I, and I thought it would be more comfortable for them to be together, because if they got tired of me, they might talk to one another, and laugh at my odd ways behind my back. But one or the other, if not both of them, I must have. Lord bless me, how do you think I can live poking by myself? I have been always used till this winter to have Charlotte with me. Come, Miss Marianne, let us strike hands upon the bargain, and if Miss Dashwood will change her mind by and by, why, so much the better. I thank you, ma'am, sincerely thank you, said Marianne with warmth. Your invitation has ensured my gratitude forever, and it would give me such happiness, yes, almost the greatest happiness I am capable of, to be able to accept it. But my mother, my dearest, kindest mother, I feel the justice of what Eleanor has urged, and if she were to be made less happy, less comfortable by our absence, oh no, nothing should tempt me to leave her. It should not, must not be a struggle. Mrs. Jennings repeated her assurance that Mrs. Dashwood could spare them perfectly well, and Eleanor, who now understood her sister and saw to what indifference to almost everything else she was carried by her eagerness to be with Willoughby again, made no farther direct opposition to the plan, and merely referred it to her mother's decision, from whom, however, she scarcely expected to receive any support in her endeavour to prevent a visit, which she could not approve of for Marianne, and which on her own account she had particular reasons to avoid. Whatever Marianne was desirous of, her mother would be eager to promote. She could not expect to influence the latter to cautiousness of conduct in an affair respecting which she had never been able to inspire her with distrust. And she dared not explain the motive of her own disinclination for going to London, because she didn't want to meet Edward there, right? She wants to keep her distance. But she knows now that Marianne wants to go because she wishes, she hopes she can see Willoughby there. That Marianne, fastidious as she was, thoroughly acquainted with Mrs. Jennings's manners, and invariably disgusted by them, should overlook every inconvenience of that kind, should disregard whatever must be most wounding to her irritable feelings, in her pursuit of one object, was such a proof, so strong, so full of the importance of that object to her, as Eleanor, in spite of all that had passed, was not prepared to witness. On being informed of the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood, persuaded that such an excursion would be productive of much amusement to both her daughters, and perceiving through all her affectionate attention to herself how much the heart of Marianne was in it, would not hear of their declining the offer upon her account, insisted on their both accepting it directly, and then began to foresee with her usual cheerfulness a variety of advantages that would accrue to them all from this separation. I am delighted with the plan, she cried. It is exactly what I could wish. Margaret and I shall be as much benefited by it as yourselves. When you and the Middletons are gone, we shall go on so quietly and happily together with our books and our music. You will find Margaret so improved when you come back again. And I have a little plan of alteration for your bedrooms too, which may now be performed without inconvenience to anyone. It is very right that you should go to town. I would have every young woman of your condition in life acquainted with the manners and amusements of London. You will be under the care of a motherly good sort of woman, of whose kindness to you I can have no doubt. And in all probability you will see your brother, and whatever may be his faults, or the faults of his wife, when I considered whose son he is, I cannot bear to have you so wholly estranged from each other. She's such a lovely woman, Mrs. Dashwood. Of course, she will miss her daughters, but she wants them to go to have this experience of being in London society, learning London's ways and amusements, manners. And even though she hates her daughter-in-law, is that daughter-in-law? Not really. Well, the wife of John Dashwood, because John is not her son. Complicated family relations. Still, he is the son of her husband, and she cannot bear the thought of them being estranged because if he was the son, he is son of her beloved husband. It means he's a good person, even though he has a terrible wife. Though with your usual anxiety for our happiness, said Eleanor, you have been obviating every impediment to the present scheme which occurred to you, there is still one objection which, in my opinion, cannot be so easily removed. Marian's countenance sunk. And what, said Mrs. Dashwood, is my dear prudent Eleanor going to suggest? What formidable obstacle is she now to bring forward? No, do not let me hear a word about the expense of it. My objection is this. Though I think very well of Mrs. Jennings' heart, she is not a woman whose society can afford us pleasure, or whose protection will give us consequence. Now let's take a look at this footnote. I think it is important for 117. What does it mean to give consequence? Social importance. Eleanor fears, not without reason, that Mrs. Jennings, the widow of a man in trade, can provide little access to the genteel or fashionable London society to which the Dashwood girls are entitled by birth, if not by their income, a society in which the right social connections are supremely important for consequence. So that's the difference between the Dashwoods and the Middletons. The Jennings, Mrs. Jennings. Mrs. Jennings was the wife, is the widow of a tradesman, so someone who became wealthy because of business, profit from business, a profession, so was not born rich. And the Dashwoods are part of a genteel family, so they have the name and the reputation and the titles, but not the money anymore. So you see what Eleanor is hinting at here, that it would not be good for their own social standards, social consequences to be seen with Mrs. Jennings and her circle of people in London. That is very true, replied her mother. But of her society, separately from that of other people, you will scarcely have anything at all, and you will almost always appear in public with Lady Middleton. Now, Lady Middleton is a lady, right? So she and Sir John Middleton, they own Barton Park. So they are landowners, they are genteel. So they should be close to Lady Middleton and not to Mrs. Jennings. If Eleanor is frightened away by her dislike of Mrs. Jennings, said Marianne, at least it need not prevent my accepting her invitation. I have no such scruples, and I am sure I could put up with every unpleasantness of that kind with very little effort. Eleanor could not help smiling at this display of indifference towards the manners of a person to whom she had often had difficulty in persuading Marianne to behave with tolerable politeness, and resolved within herself that if her sister persisted in going, she would go likewise, as she did not think it proper that Marianne should be left to the sole guidance of her own judgment, or that Mrs. Jennings should be abandoned to the mercy of Marianne for all the comfort of her domestic hours. To this determination she was the more easily reconciled by recollecting that Edward Ferrars, by Lucy's account, was not to be in town before February, and that their visit, without any unreasonable abridgment, might be previously finished. So you know what Eleanor says? If Marian wants to go, I have to go because I'm the moral compass here. I cannot leave the two of them together alone and leave Marianne to her own judgment. I will have you both go, said Mrs. Dashwood. These objections are nonsensical. You will have much pleasure in being in London, and especially in being together. And if Eleanor would ever condescend to anticipate enjoyment, she would foresee it there from a variety of sources. She would perhaps expect some from improving her acquaintance with her sister-in-law's family. Eleanor had often wished for an opportunity of attempting to weaken her mother's dependence on the attachment of Edward and herself, that the shock might be the less when the whole truth were revealed. And now on this attack, though almost hopeless of success, she forced herself to begin her design by saying as calmly as she could, I like Edward Ferrars very much, and shall always be glad to see him. But as to the rest of the family, it is a matter of perfect indifference to me whether I am ever known to them or not. Mrs. Dashwood smiled and said nothing. Marianne lifted up her eyes in astonishment, and Eleanor conjectured that she might as well have held her tongue. After very little farther discourse, it was finally settled that the invitation should be fully accepted. Mrs. Jennings received the information with a great deal of joy and many assurances of kindness and care, nor was it a matter of pleasure merely to her. Sir John was delighted, for to a man whose prevailing anxiety was the dread of being alone, remember that? The empty characters dread being alone. The acquisition of two to the number of inhabitants in London was something. Even Lady Middleton took the trouble of being delighted, which was putting herself rather out of her way. And as for the Miss Steeles, especially Lucy, they had never been so happy in their lives as this intelligence made them. That's the sarcasm here in the narrator's voice. Huh? Eleanor submitted to the arrangement which counteracted her wishes, with less reluctance than she had expected to feel. With regard to herself, it was now a matter of unconcern whether she went to town or not. And when she saw her mother so thoroughly pleased with the plan, and her sister, exhilarated by it in look, voice, and manner, restored to all her usual animation, and elevated to more than her usual gaiety, she could not be dissatisfied with the cause, and would hardly allow herself to distrust the consequence. Marianne's joy was almost a degree beyond happiness, so great was the perturbation of her spirits and her impatience to be gone. Her unwillingness to quit her mother was her only restorative to calmness, and at the moment of parting, her grief on that score was excessive. Her mother's affliction was hardly less, and Eleanor was the only one of the three who seemed to consider the separation as anything short of eternal. The exaggerated ones, the dramatic Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne, and Eleanor rolling her eyes like, this is not forever, guys. Their departure took place in the first week in January. The Middletons were to follow in about a week. The Miss Steeles kept their station at the park and were to quit it only with the rest of the family. And that is the end of chapter 25, or chapter 3 from volume 2. So the Dashwood sisters are going to London. That's what we're going to read about in our next session. So in our next session, we're going to talk about chapters 26, 7, 8, 9. So from 26 to 29. And we'll see what's going to happen to the sisters in London. So Eleanor wants to avoid seeing Edward at all costs because he's engaged to someone else. And she knows he will be there only in February, so that's okay. Marianne, on the other hand, is impatient to go because she hopes that she will see Willoughby there and that they will reconnect. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's session. I see that Megan left a message that she had to leave to the office, but that she would catch up the last bit. Thank you so much for the session so far. I absolutely love it. Thank you for your participation and for being here. I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation, and I will see you next week for our session number 8. I'll see you then.